The second biggest problem with Peter Zeihan is that he doesn't understand history, which makes his China analysis mostly worthless. I agree with Zeihan that U.S. power now and in the future is vastly underestimated. But he goes a lot further, claiming that everything about our modern world is determined by U.S. empire and nothing would function without it. Zeihan is missing a little thing called the Industrial Revolution and often seems to have no idea what was going on during the 19th century. These oversights are the reason why Zeihan keeps getting the future, and China in particular, so terribly wrong.
Well, let's start with the punchline. China won't exist as an industrialized, unified nation-state within a decade.
But before we get to that, who is Peter Zeihan? Why am I so jealous of him, and why do I feel compelled to make a second produced video about his mistakes? Peter Zeihan came up through Stratfor, George Friedman's not quite respectable geopolitics consulting firm, before setting out on his own in 2012. His dynamic presentations and charismatic delivery brought him success on the corporate, government, consulting, and speaking circuit. Since becoming aware of him 3 years ago or so, I've jealously watched his conquest of the internet. His supremely confident presentation of some compelling data on a range of topics is always entertaining and frequently very interesting. Commenters accuse me of being a hater, but it's quite the opposite. In fact, I love the guy, especially since he resurrected this YouTube channel. His charisma, cleverness, and prolific posting have smashed through a YouTube algorithm that would be happier if we were all talking about video games instead of international politics. I've been on YouTube for over a decade now. For years, I labored in almost complete obscurity, until 2017 when I found a profitable niche by diving in on the U.S.'s obscene relationship with Saudi Arabia. My channel rocketed along happily until 2019 with multiple videos viewed tens or even hundreds of thousands of times. Then, in 2019, YouTube's policy changed. They decided to crack down on misinformation, and I am enough of a lib that I think that that's a good thing. Unfortunately, I quickly learned that talking about Saudi Arabia and U.S. policy in the Middle East is definitely one of the things that YouTube considers to be misinformation. I did not expect the leopards to eat my face. By 2021, my videos had fallen from hundreds of thousands of views to 1,000 to 2,000 views per video. For a couple years now, I've been looking into TikTok, podcasts, or just giving up and getting a real job. The one thing that still worked was YouTube drama videos. Critiquing other YouTube channels doesn't strike me as the best use of my time, but it does allow me to get a few more eyeballs. But only tens of thousands of views, not the hundreds of thousands I had gotten accustomed to getting 5 years ago. Then came Peter Zeihan. For a couple years now, he's been throwing a backpack, heading out into the woods, and bludgeoning the algorithm with multiple geopolitical takes a week. And it's worked out marvelously for him. About a year back, I did a critique of one of his videos. It did okay, and I moved on. Then, last fall, that Peter Zeihan video caught fire. It became my first video in 5 years to cross 100,000 views, and now it's my second most viewed video ever. That success has spilled over to the rest of my content, and I have temporarily stopped filling out job applications. I owe Peter Zeihan a lot, but I also owe Zeihan and his growing audience an honest critique. His skill at explaining geopolitics has resurrected a whole segment of YouTube, but it also means that his mistakes are being spread far and wide. I've seen regurgitated Peter Zeihan talking points show up in a surprising range of outlets in the mainstream media. Last time I talked about how all of his predictions rely on a U.S. withdrawal that just isn't happening. Today I want to talk about how badly Zeihan misrepresents the history of the world and how that leads to many, many bad China predictions. Those who are only familiar with his more recent videos and interviews may be a bit confused by my critiques. Folks accuse me of misconstruing his arguments and accusing him of making stronger claims than he actually does. But my videos aren't based on his videos, they're based on his books. Specifically, 2 of his books that I've read over the past year. Disunited Nations, published in 2020, and The End of the World is Just the Beginning, published in 2022. The predictions he makes in these books have already begun to look pretty shaky due to recent events. The United States, that has built a new Ukrainian South Korea in the middle of the old Soviet Union and is helping Israel slaughter tens of thousands, is obviously not withdrawing from anything. So in recent videos, I think he's been distancing himself a little bit from the wild claims he makes in his books. My last video pointed out how every prediction in The End of the World is Just the Beginning relies on a vision of American withdrawal that just isn't happening. But even if the US were to withdraw, Zeihan overstates the chaos that would ensue, because he doesn't really understand the way the world changed around the beginning of the 1800s. Regular viewers may be surprised to hear this, but my disagreement with Zeihan stems from the fact that I think the United States is, wait for it, less powerful and less historically significant than he thinks it is. That's a sign of just how much Peter Zeihan centers the U.S., because I typically blame the United States for everything. The way Zeihan tells it, the world changed dramatically in 1945. The United States supposedly built a historically unique world.
We didn't trade goods, we traded ammo. And if you saw something that you thought you needed, you went out and you took the damn thing. You confiscated it, you colonized it, you expanded into empire. And those empires clashed over resources and access and markets, and those clashes brought us wars, and those wars ultimately brought us to World War II, which took the entire system and made it crash. Now, at the end of that war, the Americans drew their allies together and tried something new. We said, instead of everyone having a sequestered imperial economic system that they guarded with their own navies, the U.S. Navy, the only one to survive the war, would patrol the global oceans for everyone so that anyone could go anywhere at any time.
The deal was that if you got on board with American capitalism, then the United States would not only defend your country from all potential predators, it would also open the U.S.'s uniquely geographically gifted home markets to all of our allies. The past 80 years of prosperity have been entirely due to U.S. generosity, but now U.S. generosity is being withdrawn. According to Zeihan, the U.S. isn't just going to get a little punchier and stingier with trade deals as it has under Trump and Biden. According to Zeihan, we're going to stop garrisoning Europe and Asia after 8 decades. We're also going to stop defending the world's sea lanes. This, combined with the demographic crunch brought on by decades of below-replacement fertility, are going to plunge the world into a nightmarish existence. Zeihan speaks frequently about the end of countries like China and Germany and suggests that billions of people will be lost to starvation over the coming decade. According to Zeihan, millions should have starved to death last winter. He's quite literally talking about the end of the world as we know it. So we already established in the last video that the United States isn't going anywhere. But if it did, would the world fall into chaos? Well, no, because Zeihan's assumptions about how brand new and different the world after 1945 was are just incorrect. It's like he edits out 150 years of history. On page 52 of his 2022 book, Zeihan asserts that we created the world's first truly global security and economic architecture. This is just wrong. That was the British in the 1800s. There have been breaks for world wars, and tariffs used to be a lot higher, but we have had a largely stable and free-ish world trading system for white people for around 200 years now. The pre-American world of battling empires that he describes definitely existed. It was called the Age of Mercantilism, but it ended 130 years earlier than Zeihan says it did. In the 1600s and 1700s, the world really was a brutal battle space for European and non-European empires. The Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch, followed by the British and the French, battled for ports and trade access everywhere, and the shipping of rival empires was usually fair game. This is the savage world of Hobbesian competition that Zeihan thinks the world is destined to fall back into. But that world ended in 1815 with British hegemony, not in 1945 with U.S. hegemony. And the 200-plus years of industrialization that the entire world has experienced at this point gave us a lot more than two English-speaking hegemons. Zeihan refuses to believe that the technologies and cultural innovations that made modernity possible have been internalized all over the world and in every country. Things like computers, mass literacy, and nationalism aren't going to just disappear if Anglo hegemony pulls back. Zeihan doesn't appear to understand that. In his 2020 book, he provides a picture of the British Empire that is flat-out fantasy. The British model is far less complicated than the American system. There is no global set of rules, no paying swaths of countries to be on your side, no trade among nations to facilitate, no chronic need to militarily protect other countries, no guaranteeing independence for weak states. There is only flat-out conquering the world. So every sentence in this paragraph is wrong, to differing degrees. It's a cartoonish misunderstanding of the pre-American world that sits at the foundation of all of Zeihan's analysis. Britain's complex informal empire of financial dominance that it used to manage most of its supposed imperial rivals was much more important than the uncomplicated red bits on the map. Britain was weaker than the United States, so it was more violent in enforcing the global set of rules, but those rules very much existed. Britain maintained a trade deficit throughout its time on top, so the British were very much paying swaths of countries to be on their side, through the same mechanism Zeihan identifies the U.S. as using to pay other countries. This statement on trade is so absurdly wrong that one of Zeihan's research assistants must have corrected him, because his 2022 book is filled with passages that demolish it, talking about the trade bonanzas Russia and the United States experienced under the British system. Peter Zeihan has apparently never heard of the Crimean War or the rest of British 19th century policy, which was all about protecting the independence of the much weaker Ottoman Empire. By his 2022 book, Zeihan, or his research assistants, managed to document just how much trade was going on during the period of British hegemony. But this book still makes extraordinarily overblown claims about what happened in 1945 when the United States decided to rebuild and restructure, a little more formally, the trade architecture that the British had already been running between the 1840s and 1914. The U.S. break with the traditions of international relations extended to the nature of human existence itself, resulting in a fundamental rewiring of the human condition. That wasn't the United States. That was the Industrial Revolution and the technologies, the mass literacy, and the nationalism that came with it. Now, I'm not saying that the U.S. era we are living in today is exactly the same as the British era of the 1800s. The world is massively richer and more complex, just as the U.S. is almost infinitely more powerful than the British were. But the fundamental rewiring of the human condition came in the early 1800s, not the mid-1900s. The industrial British and American eras are more different from everything that came before than they are from each other. Zeihan's great error is that he credits the United States with all of the very real rewiring of the human condition that 200 years of industrialization has brought us. U.S. hegemony is very important, but it's not that important. Zeihan believes that all of modernity, technology, and the basic functioning of most economies comes from the United States, not from distributed development. You can see this mistake everywhere, especially in his Russia coverage. He spent the first year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine talking about how most of their oil production was going to break down without U.S. and European engineers.
And then you've got a Sakhalin project, which is this far eastern island north of Japan. Now, the problem that the Chinese and everyone are going to have with these projects is that the Russians can't operate any of them themselves.
That is not what happened. The most recent news I could find about Sakhalin indicates that Russia is actually producing more from those wells that it can sell. In retrospect, assuming that the Russians couldn't figure out how to extract petroleum seems pretty stupid. But it's emblematic of the sort of contempt that Zeihan feels for the whole world outside of the United States. This contempt suffuses his China coverage.
Well, let's start with the punchline. China won't exist as an industrialized, unified nation state within a decade.
If I was a betting man, I'd said we'd get a civil war complete with warlords in the north that kills over half the population within the next quarter century.
There is no recognition that China has its own history of consolidation, and that it might have been massively changed by the same forces of industrialization, mass literacy, and nationalism that have rewired the human condition everywhere else. First off, he's got a really dubious read on Chinese history before industrialization. It may not be technically wrong, but it strikes me as pretty misleading. He portrays Chinese history as millennia of disunity and chaos, periods in which the territories of China are both politically unified and under centralized Han control are painfully thin, amounting to less than a third of the Han ethnicity's multi-millennia history. This is technically correct, but is a read that requires you to ignore vast periods of great Chinese success. That strong "and" there is key. The Ming Dynasty from the 1300s to the 1600s seems to be the only one that meets Zeihan's criteria. The 400 years of the Yuan and Qing dynasties saw massive expansion of China's borders and long periods of peace and prosperity. The Qing in particular, ruling from the 1600s to 1911, defined what China was in a globalizing world. But it is technically correct to point out that the Yuan and Qing dynasties started out with foreign conquest, so the emperors were never Han Chinese. Zeihan is not technically wrong. But looked at more seriously, China has spent the vast majority of the past 800 years as a unified, if not expanding, entity. This makes his claims of historical chaos look pretty silly. Zeihan is 100% correct to say that China's long history is interrupted over and over by brief periods of chaos and rebellion. This defines every pre-industrial entity on the planet. I also think Zeihan is right to point to the many, many weaknesses in China's model. First and foremost, demographics. I agree entirely that China has a crisis coming. The deep contradictions between the country's capitalist success and its communist ideology are likely to come to a head in our lifetimes. Deep political disruption and maybe even a brief civil war are possible. In the absolute worst-case scenario, I do think it's conceivable, not likely, but conceivable, that China could lose control of Tibet and Xinjiang again. But how many people live in Tibet and Xinjiang again? Estimates are controversial, but all told, it's probably less than 50 million people out of China's population of over 1 billion. Losing these areas, which again I think is very unlikely, would probably save China a lot of money and hassle. Zeihan's other predictions of long-term division of the Chinese heartland between Beijing and Shanghai and other areas are nonsense, brought about by his historical ignorance. Zeihan is right that the U.S. world system has played a role in China's stability and strength over the past 75 years. But it's industrialization's rewiring of the human condition that has made the most difference. When the commies took over in 1949, China's literacy rate was somewhere between 5 and 13%. China's past 800 years of mostly unity were built on the backs of illiterate peasants who didn't particularly care which set of thugs was oppressing them. China's literacy rate today is 99%. Like the rest of the world, that literate majority urban population has been indoctrinated with an ideology of independence, unity, and nationalism that makes China infinitely stronger than it was 75 years ago. As a quick side note, the United States is the most powerful entity in human history by far. But it's these basic dynamics of growing literacy and growing nationalism that made it impossible for us to conquer impoverished countries like Vietnam and Afghanistan. China is a lot richer than those countries, and nobody is even contemplating a physical invasion. These dynamics are a double-edged sword for China. Vietnam, Mongolia, India, and the rest of China's neighbors have all gone through the same process. The millennia-long Chinese expansion into new territory is probably over. The difficulty China has experienced in hanging on to thinly populated Tibet and Xinjiang over the past 75 years illustrates how difficult conquest has become. But the flip side of that is that the Chinese heartland has now become impossible to conquer as well. Post-industrialization and post-mass literacy, warring elites don't have the only vote anymore. The Chinese population, the Chinese mass public, exists in a way that it simply did not 75 years ago. and it's not going to be content to be divided up. China certainly has a crisis coming, but assuming it's going to just disintegrate the way it did in the 1930s or the 900s is absurd. Peter Zeihan doesn't acknowledge the significance of the Industrial Revolution or the fact that we have been living in a globalized world for 2 centuries. According to him, U.S. hegemony is the only thing that matters. So he's going to keep getting China wrong, and he's going to keep calling for a collapse that just isn't coming. Just as a general note, well beyond Zeihan, most of the China prediction game is ridiculous. You can find dozens of think tankers telling you the exact date that a hyper-aggressive China will definitely invade Taiwan. You can also find a flock of academics who will tell you that China's wisdom and thousands of years of history and non-European serenity means that it has no aggressive intentions and is certain to rise peacefully. Both of these camps are completely full of shit. We are 10, maybe 15 years into this completely new dynamic of China as a great power in the industrial era. Nobody knows what they are going to do. Xi Jinping does not know what China is going to do. We just don't have enough data to make any kind of meaningful prediction, which is why I don't try to do it. As I mentioned last time, Zeihan is in a weird place. He's reaching a wider and wider audience, but as those passages from his 2022 book reveal, he's beginning to realize that his "America is all that matters" ideas are just wrong. He's not going to stop talking. He's doing too well. But what is informing his content now?
One of the solutions, although it's exhausting, is just take on more clients. Because every time I take on a new client, I have to learn the world through their eyes. And that's very useful. It's just very time consuming.
I'm happy to say that I am doing some work with the Defense Department. I can't talk about the details, obviously.
Zeihan is totally right that his work for business and government gives him a unique window on the world and reams of useful data. Unfortunately, that also means that as his ideas fail, he's begun to see more and more of the world through the eyes of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, who are some of the dumbest people on the planet. Zeihan also appears to do a ton of work for oil and gas companies. I have a hunch that his vendetta against the green transition and electric vehicles comes from the fact that he has completely internalized the priorities of Texas oil companies.
The only group that I have seen that is more diluted and has a bigger disconnect between what they believe and what actually happens are the Greens.
One of the many, many effects of Lopez Obrador's election in Mexico is the complete destruction of crude production out of Mexico.
You probably won't be surprised at this point to hear that that did not happen at all. We are still importing close to 2 million barrels of oil a day from Mexico. I'm kind of getting the sense that Peter Zeihan might see it as kind of his job to foster fear around oil prices, or at least all the people he works for want that. The more scared people are, the higher oil prices are. But I'm not 100% sure about that. Conclusively debunking Zeihan's energy takes would take a lot more research than I want to do for a YouTube drama video. Thankfully, I happen to know more about U.S. foreign policy than most of the people actively making that policy. And I am quite confident in saying that many of the stories Zeihan is currently selling in that arena are nonsense.
And we have to go back to a world where trade is more focused on the countries that have a better demographic and security infrastructure, because the Americans are no longer patrolling the global oceans anymore.
This flat assertion by U.S. Navy lobbyists that we need hundreds more ships patrolling the world's sea lanes like Spider-Man watching over New York City is nonsense that nobody ever challenges, and it really bothers me. That's not how any of this works. The United States probably does keep the sea lanes safe to some degree, but that's through the threat of overwhelming violence. We can shoot missiles from any one of hundreds of bases all over the world. We don't need another 400 $500 ships that can be sunk by $1,000 drones. If you look at the U.S. Navy's own ship numbers, they fell in the 1990s. In the entire world, over the 30 years since then, a single leg of international travel, the Red Sea, has been a problem. Think about that for a second. If fewer U.S. ships automatically equal more piracy and danger everywhere, why is there only one problem area? And what's actually going on in that one problem area? Well, defending the sea lanes with the threat of overwhelming violence requires that all countries have a unified central government that we can threaten. And over the past 20 years, the United States has made it its business to undermine and destroy the central governments of two countries on the Red Sea. In 2006, the Bush administration decided to crush the newly reunited government of Somalia, igniting the wave of piracy that gave us that Tom Hanks movie. In 2009, the Obama administration started bombing Yemen regularly. This wasn't the only reason the country fell apart, but it certainly didn't help. In 2015, Obama greenlit the Saudi invasion of Yemen, supercharging Yemeni nationalism, which made the Houthis into the threat they are today. U.S. military expansion is not the solution to worldwide piracy. It's actually the cause of the only two examples of piracy you can point to this century. I could complain about this U.S. Navy fantasy for an hour. In fact, I already have. We've got a whole episode on this topic up at the podcast right now, available on Spotify, Apple, and a wide range of other podcast platforms. The Navy thing is an example of a broader recent Zeihan tick that he shares with the U.S. government. This is vastly overestimating the use and the efficacy of military power, no matter who is using it. Like almost every foreign policy analyst other than myself, Zeihan assumed that Russia's military would steamroll Ukraine once it invaded. Zeihan, like the Pentagon, continues to have no understanding of the power of industrialized nationalism. He spent most of 2022 talking about the massive threat to Moldova, and is still trying to convince everybody he talks to that Russia has a serious chance of invading Poland.
If there's anything we know about the Russians, is that for them to feel that they are safe, they have to be able to plug access to their territories. And that means reaching the Danube Delta, and that means reaching the Vistula, which is in downtown Warsaw, and that means eliminating the Baltic states. So that's 5 NATO countries right there in the crosshairs. We know they're coming for them eventually, if they can.
It's a horrific artillery battle of inches that he believes will somehow end up as a battle of thousands of miles again. And not just in one direction.
But if Ukraine wins everything, doesn't stop the war, just means there's a pause until the Russians feel they can try again. And so if the Ukrainians are going to prevent that, they have to cross into Russia proper, and they have to neutralize a couple of cities that serve as logistical hubs for the war. That's Rostov-on-Don.
So after years of believing that Ukraine was incapable of defending itself, he has now switched to believing that Russia is going to just sort of dry up and blow away. In that conversation, he also illustrated some pretty stunning ignorance of the Middle East.
Hamas won Gaza Strip elections back in the mid-2000s, then never had elections again.
There was never an election to control Gaza. You can look it up, not that anybody in U.S. media ever does. The political details matter, especially in the Middle East, but Zeihan isn't interested in learning about them. I have to expand on this bit of anti-Palestinian propaganda in a future video, but why don't we look at Zeihan's assessment of the Red Sea conflict from 3 months ago?
And then you've got a Shiite group called the Houthis that are wildly incompetent at most work and really can't hold themselves together.
Sorry, I found this clip while I was editing, and it was so bad that I absolutely had to include it. Peter Zeihan has pointed out that he doesn't know much about Yemen and doesn't want to know much about Yemen, but it is pretty striking that he could get something this basic this wrong. The Houthis, bad dudes for sure, but incompetent? These are the people who, over the past decade, have gone from, the caves of northern Yemen to controlling the vast majority of the country. They are Yemen's government.
Over the past decade, they have humiliated Saudi Arabia.
The Houthis that are wildly incompetent at most work and really can't hold themselves together.
Just describing the Houthis as incompetent is a real indication that much of what Peter Zeihan knows he gets from U.S. government propaganda. He is a lot smarter than CNN or what have you, but when it comes to the Middle East, he's got the same dumb sources and is basically just doing U.S. government stenography.
So they've been basically needling the United States and needling Israel because it's good PR across the Middle East. But I don't think they're really interested in bleeding for it because their real fight requires every asset they have later on. So I would guess that we're going to see things simmer down in Yemen, and I can go back to ignoring it.
Well, 4 months later, it's not over. All of our impressive military force has proved to be meaningless against a country we've already been bombing for a decade and a half, and the United States is desperately trying to get the Houthis to negotiate. This actually doesn't matter much, because the world shipping industry is infinitely more durable than Zeihan imagines. Egypt is in serious trouble without those Suez Canal revenues, but the rest of the world is muddling through just fine. Over and over again in recent years, Zeihan has predicted doom. The insurance companies are all constantly on the edge of rebelling, ending worldwide shipping. Well, the oil is still flowing, it's just that many fewer ships are now insured. The world was going to starve last winter without Russian gas and Ukrainian phosphates, and that didn't happen either. All of these systems and trade routes are much more durable than Zeihan expects, because they are much older than he can allow himself to understand. The world system is not just the American system. The United States is not going anywhere anytime soon, but when we do inevitably shuffle off of the stage, the world will not be anywhere near as hopeless and helpless as Peter Zeihan imagines.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And have I mentioned recently that I have an email list? If I lose access to any of these platforms, it will be the only way for me to reach my audience. Please do sign up, either at the link here or the link in the video description. Thanks.